So Dr. Richards asked me to leave my bags there and go on and register. So I went. It was very short. It was a much shorter period than I'd ever experienced at Bethany or at WVU. So I registered for several courses in international relations, international law, and I came back and I told him I'm taking one of his classes. He said, well, thank you for that. Now I said, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go find some place to live. Well, he says, you know, seniors are not living on campus at GW at that time. So what was I to do? I got a bus, I got a cab, and I found some scrap papers in my pocket with the name of somebody from Wheeling that lived up here in Washington. And he was living in a place called Wesley Hall in D.C., right off DuPont Circle. So I told the bus driver to take me there. And I went. It was Bud Ryan was his name. And he lived only about 3 or 4 blocks from my house in Wheeling, in Moorwood. He said, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm going to school at GW. Well, good. He was working. He had finished he didn't go in for a doctorate. I don't think he even got a master's. He was a football player at WVU. So he said, you can sleep here until you find something. So I did. I slept there at Wesley Hall. So then later, the next day, I sought around and I found a place. Wesley Hall was a connection of homes. It wasn't a hall. It was a home owned by somebody, and he rented it out to various people. But there was a separate cafeteria. That was very nice. So for $60 a month, I paid for rent and for 2 meals, morning and dinner. That was very good. The GI Bill covered it, and my disability check, in addition, covered it. So I registered there, and I went to school there. I had a hefty walk to go down to GW, and I used a phrase that John Wayne always used, oh, it's just a good stretch of the legs. And that's what it was. It was really a good stretch of the legs getting to GW. I stayed there, and I got a lot of graduate study there. And then the GI Bill was running out. So I had to find a source of income. I was prepared to take a part-time job somewhere, but I couldn't find one. So I called up my parents and told them what had happened to me. And that's when Dad spoke with this Jewish gentleman who sold him his beverages and so forth, who in turn talked to Senator Neely. So that's how I got to work for Senator Neely, this Jewish friend. And I owe this man, really, the start of my career was because of what he did for me. He's passed away now, and I regret deeply that I was not personally able to thank him. I know my dad thanked him, but to me it was important that I thank him. And I tried to find descendants of his to speak with and tell them what he did for me. And I talked to Arthur Rybeck's wife, Siva, another Jewish friend of mine. She's still alive in Wheeling, a widow now, of course. Arthur passed away. And she looked into it at her synagogue, and she knew the name of that man. But he says, he left here, Lou, and I heard that he died. So I never got to thank that man, and that has always bothered me. But I got the job, and I was able to work for Senator Neely, but this time I was going to Georgetown. I got more courses in international relations at Georgetown, and it was covered me there. I was okay. I took my oral test for my doctorate. I took my written test for my doctorate. Yeah, I achieved distinction, and I started a dissertation, a thesis for my doctorate. I started that. And then I had a Turkish friend, Karim Key. He and I were in the department together. He worked on Turkey, I worked on Greece and Cyprus. That's the first time in the history of the State Department where you had 2 people of those ethnicities in which they were always, fighting in ancient and modern times to work on these countries. And we became the best of friends. Yes, that's how I got in with Senator Neely, but I had previously, a year before, submitted an application to the State Department. I didn't expect much would happen, but when Senator Neely offered me the job, I had to go. So I had a report, I had a telephone call from the State Department one day asking me to come in for an interview. I was surprised. What should I do? I didn't want to leave Senator Neely. He wanted me to stay. And his aide, Robert Mullan, who later became a congressman, as did his son, became a congressman from West Virginia. They both wanted me to stay. So there's a place for you here. And Senator Neely said to me one day, why do you want to go over there and work for those eggheads? And I don't know what he was talking about at the time. I said, well, Senator, I love working with you, and you taught me a lot about government and the importance of the legislative branch. I never knew that, I said. And that's been very useful for me. And I met many famous people by working there. Many famous people. And I met William Elliott from Harvard University, the founder of, the grandson of the founder. So I liked it there, and I made good friends with various people. But here I've spent all these courses, all this money and time working on foreign affairs. And I had no intention of working, I wanted to stay with what I wished to do. And I wanted to graduate, get my degree, and go teach in some small college. That's what I wanted. I didn't think about government. But a job in the foreign affairs at the State Department could be very useful. So that's what I did, and he was very sad about that. But he said to me as I left, I want, Louis, and I quote this, what I said, he said to me, young man, I want you to continue to finish and get your doctorate. But someday, I hope you'll come and teach in a college in West Virginia. And then he turned to Bob Mollahan and he said, Bob, I want you to follow this young man's application at the State Department. I didn't know what that meant. I went for my interview to the personnel office, and this woman said to me in charge, we've had a lot of trouble over you. We've been getting calls from Capitol Hill about you. What's that all about? I said, I don't know. I've worked for a senator, and that's when I learned what Senator Neely, when he told Bob Mollahan, follow that application and see what happens. That was his way of telling Mollahan, by God, you cover that. We want him in there if that's what he wants. So I was very happy about that. I was told I'd be assigned to work on Greece and Cyprus. That's what and because of my Greek background and so forth, the Greek language, that's what they gave me to do. And then my colleagues, one was a Turk, Karim Ki, who worked on Turkey, and another gentleman worked on Iran. It was the Greek, Cyprus, Turkish, Iranian branch of the State Department. And that's where I worked until one day I learned so much about all those countries, but then a war broke out in Vietnam. And I had become an expert on counterinsurgency by working on Greece and Cyprus, because both those countries had wars after World War II. They had communist insurgencies. And I learned about the business of how to fight local people, guerrillas, anti-guerrilla warfare. I became an expert. So I wasn't getting along very well with the guy that was in charge of me, the Greek guy in the State Department on Greece. I wasn't getting along very well with him. And I told him one day, I said, you know, I've been here for 5 years. How does one put in for a promotion? I'm just asking. He said to me, look, I asked for a promotion. I haven't had one in years. And he was a GS 14 or 13. So his promotion would have to be branch chief, and he would take over the job of our boss. Well, that wasn't possible. So I went to my boss one day, and Joe Upton, wonderful man, a specialist on Iran, a very important wedding gift at our wedding. I still have it framed in another room, in the dining room. Very ancient piece, 14th, 15th century tapestry. He liked me very much. And it was through him that he found out that there was an opening on Southeast Asia. 1957. I was given this job in that particular branch of the Near East and Africa Division. And there I met everybody, including a gentleman named Seymour Goodman and another called Jerry Freed, who were the economists for the entire branch covering all of these countries. I met them all very nice people. But Seymour and I had something in common. He was a veteran. None of the others were. So I would ask questions, and he would tell me about himself, and I would tell him about myself. And he asked me, did you ever get hurt? I said, well, I got hurt, but nothing like you, because I already knew what he had done, and everybody knows that story. And so we became very close with Seymour. And Seymour would always take off at lunch. And not a few times we would have lunch together. But then he said, Lou, I got to go running. And he would go and use his lunchtime to run. And he would run all the way across the Memorial Bridge and back. And he was in good shape. He was always in very good shape. So after a while, we started having lunch more often. And I found out all about him. And I met the Goodman family while we're still living in Virginia at 1412 North Harrison Street. And that continued until the day I left in 1957. But Seymour had left 2 years or 3 years earlier to go to Europe, to go to Ireland, because he was the only Foreign Service officer in that branch that I was in. Everybody else was civil service. Seymour stood out as the only Foreign Service officer. So he left in the mid-50s to go to Ireland. And I recall he told me one day, he says, Lou, could you take care of this for me? I said, what is it? Well, this is a box here that I got. I got all my medals in there. Would you take care of them for me? I said, well, sure, Seymour. So I put them up at our house in 1412. We had an attic above, and I put them up there. And many years later, when he returned, I was still working at the State Department. He was going to transfer out and go to the Economics Department at some point. But he asked me one day, he was looking for his medals. He said, I can't find my medals. I said, well, Seymour, you gave them to me. They're upstairs. You want them? Well, he had already gone ahead and had his boys get duplicates of those medals. But I had the original set. And I don't know exactly what he did with the original set, who got that. But I gave it back to him. He was so happy to have the original set. So we became good friends after that. Even though when he left the department and worked for the economics department, I think, we still saw each other. Then we moved over here in Maryland, and we knew about his wife and what she went through. And we just kept in touch at all times. And later, many years later, when I was asked to join, after I retired, I was asked to join the Authors Club of Washington, D.C., one of only 3 such organizations still existing. And eventually I became president of the Authors Club, and I needed a secretary. So I called up Seymour. I said, Seymour, can you? He said, sure, so I'll do it for you. So I knew where Seymour then, his wife had passed away, and he had remarried a very nice lady with whom they were family friends from way back. Hope is her name. And my son Jeff, I wasn't driving then, so my son Jeff would pick me up in Lula when Lula decided she wanted to come, and we'd go by and pick up Seymour, and then at the last meeting of the year, we would always take the wives, and we'd pick up Lula and Hope and Seymour, and we would go to that meeting at the Cosmos Club is where we met 7 times a year. That was a very enjoyable period for me, and it was particularly nice having Seymour again doing a very important job, because, you know, people were paying X amount of dollars, and we had to keep records of that, because then we had to pay the Cosmos Club. So it was a very great time, and I was so saddened when Seymour had the accident, which was not his fault entirely. That car was a deficient car in terms of his brakes, and he was going down a hill. Oh, he had called me up once before and said, Lou, can you come over and talk about Vietnam at the American University? Because he and Hope were involved in that kind of promoting classes. So I came and I gave a talk about Vietnam, and everybody liked it very much. And the young lady who lives next door to them was a Foreign Service officer, and she had married the journalist who had died, so she was a widow with children. And I asked her to come, and she came along with us. That was a very nice time. But I always had, an unusual relationship with Seymour. I think he was closest to me of just virtually anybody else in the department. There were a few people whose children called me Uncle Lou because I'd been close to them. But Seymour was, I guess because he was a veteran and a real nice guy, and we had a lot in common, I just felt closest to him. And I was saddened by that accident in which they had to come and drill a car from the top and take him out. And we saw him at the hospital. And I know the story after that, what happened. He passed away a few years ago. And I had the honor of being asked to speak at his funeral, which was very difficult for me. Very difficult. I was surprised that I was able to finish it. I almost cried when I talked about him, and I still feel that way. So in 1957, there came a time when I was asked by Mr. Upton, when I was told by Mr. Upton, that there was a job opening on Vietnam and Southeast Asia in another division. And he said, because I had been talking to him about leaving because of this Greek guy that was working there, and I found him very obnoxious. So he says, are you interested in that job? I says, yes, I am. I says, I know a lot about counterinsurgency and so forth. So I went and I saw the gentleman in charge, Mr. Stewart, who lived in my area at 1412 North Harrison Street. And yes, there is an opening on Vietnam, because the Vietnam gentleman who's covering the FSO, who's covering Vietnam, is being assigned to Paris Embassy. So we have an opening there. So I told him what my credentials were. He had this call from Joe Upton, who told him what he thought of me. So I got the job right off. The very next day, I transferred over. Matter of fact, I would go and pick up Dick Stewart, the boss, the chief of the division, and we'd go into the division itself. And when I worked there from 1957, I first covered Vietnam. Within a matter of a month or so, I was given Laos and Cambodia. So I became chief of the Indochina branch of the State Department. very quickly. And because there were other countries in Southeast Asia, but somebody else was in charge of those. And I began, given my background of the insurgencies in Greece and in Cyprus, I was able to understand that you don't fight guerrillas in conventional military terms. You have to wage counter-guerrilla war, as Americans did in Burma against the Japanese. This was a new thing for the conventional, the new thing for the generals. It was new to them, counter-guerrilla warfare. They were conventional warfare people. You drop so much of bombs, you bring in a lot of forces, etc., and that's how you beat these people. Well, you don't win a war that way. Not against internal insurgencies, because the objective here is to win the hearts and minds of the people. Well, in Vietnam, the only people that supported that government was those Vietnamese of Roman Catholic background. The vast majority of the people were Buddhist. And our policy was focused on supporting that government that was run by a Roman Catholic minority. The president of that country was No Ding Diem, and his brother No Ding Khan and No Ding Nu. They were very dictatorial. They didn't care about what the Buddhists thought out in the countryside. You had revolutions by the Buddhists. I wrote the first assessment on the Buddhist revolution that was written, and President Kennedy was so impressed with it that I was told that he took it with him again back to Hyannisport on leave to reread it again. It was the assessment. It was the first one done. So I began to develop by 1958. I saw that this was a wrong policy. I saw that the war was an unnecessary war to begin with. I had doubts about the whole thing, whereas before I was, excited by the fact. But I saw so many differences between the Cypriot and the Greek and now the Vietnamese insurgencies. Totally different. And I saw it much more complex. And my great concern was that the people at the Pentagon leadership and at the military, U.S. military leadership out in Saigon did not understand that. They saw it as a conventional war. Ergo, you had all these troops that were brought in. Kennedy was opposed to this. He did not want any ground combat troops. He did agree to have some advisors come in. Yes, Eisenhower agreed to that too, and Truman agreed to that. But there was no combat troops as far as Kennedy was concerned. That all changed when President Johnson came in, and with the assassination of President Kennedy. And Johnson was a conventional tactics man. So was my own boss, Dean Rusk, because he was in World War II. Not combat, but back in Washington. Well, in 1961, or 60 rather, a very great thing happened. A gentleman who just passed away himself about a month ago, by the name of Roger Hilsman, had fought in Burma against the Japanese. In fact, he liberated his own father, who was a colonel. Now, they were both West Pointers. He was a West Pointer, but somehow he wound up in Burma fighting the Japanese in counter-guerrilla warfare, was wounded. And his father was also had been taken prisoner. And he found out that he was in China. And he was responsible for a mission to go there, and finally found his father. And his father said to him, "What took you so long?" That's in my book. Well, when Roger took over my bureau, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where most of my career was spent, he believed in counter-guerrilla warfare. So he began, and he called me in one day. He says, "I'm going to write a strategy for this, and I'm going to take it to the president and see if we can get it approved. I'd like for you to help me with that." So I sat down with Roger. I was in my office. I was then chief of the Southeast Asia division. I'd been promoted to chief of the whole division. I felt pretty comfortable with that, but I had all of Asia now. All of Southeast Asia, rather. And he asked me to work with him, and I did very closely. He would write a draft, set it up to me. I would look at it. I would add things, change things, and went back and forth for weeks. So finally it was done. It was called A Strategy for South Vietnam. It was taken to the Chief of Staff, who happened to be my boss, the commander of our forces during the Battle of the Bulge. But he didn't remember me from Adam, of course, I know. So he went over to see him, to show him this. And he said to him, "Roger, you got to take this to the president yourself and tell it straight the way you think it is." So he did. And the president approved it. And he sent directives out to the Pentagon, to Saigon, to our military advisors in Saigon. This will be the strategy hereafter for fighting the communists in South Vietnam. And I'm very proud that I had a hand in this. However limited, it was an important hand, and I got a statement up there hanging in my office saying that great contribution that I made to foreign policy. I'm very proud of that. So he did a great job, and then later he became Assistant Secretary of State as opposed to being Director of Intelligence. Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Quite a job. And we worked very close. It's a time that I have never seen before in my 40 years experience, where an assistant secretary and a mere analyst like me, from the very beginning that I met him, were so close. I mean, he would call me up directly rather than calling up my boss to come down and see him and speak with him. Dean Rusk did not like that. Dean Rusk did not like when Kennedy would call Roger and want him to come over and chat about the problem. Rusk was very, and it was a good thing that Rusk was cut out, because he would have gone with the Pentagon, as he did, and with McNamara. So I worked very closely with Roger. He reorganized the bureau that I was in, made it very lean and hard-hitting, and we were all very, very close. And this man was fired the day that Kennedy was assassinated. Johnson approached him and says, "Look, I want you to be our ambassador to the Philippines." Well, on one of my trips to Hong Kong, I stopped off at a hotel. I didn't know this. I stopped off at a hotel. That's where I stayed. And I found out, after visiting the Consul General of Hong Kong, U.S. Consul General, he told me, "You heard about Roger?" I said, "No, what do you mean?" "He's been fired." I didn't know that. So the next morning I wake up to go to breakfast, and there's Roger and his wife Eleanor sitting at a table having breakfast. And he waves me over. And I go over and I'm really shocked. What am I going to say? I felt so sad. And he said, "You heard about what happened?" I says, "Yeah, I just heard about it, Roger." He says, "Well, that was their way of getting me out of town. Making me an ambassador to the Philippines. And I don't want any part of that. Now, where are you going?" I said, "Well, I'm going to Saigon with a colonel and a guy from CIA to urge more collaborative efforts within the U.S. mission about Vietnam. We weren't getting enough info. And he said to me, "Okay, Lou." I had sat down by then with him. And Eleanor was just, she was speechless because of what happened to Roger. And she said to me, he said to me, "Now, I'll tell you one thing, when you get to Saigon, don't forget this. Get out of town and talk to the people in the field. They are the ones who know what's going on, rather than the generals back at headquarters in Saigon." And that's exactly what I did. Yeah, in the field when I went, I had a translator with me. But I also had people, armed people, covering me. We drove by jeep most times. There was one occasion where I was flown by aircraft to go up and talk to a major general. But when I was in the field and talking to these people, I was guarded by people, and I have pictures of that effect showing that all these people who were Vietnamese who could speak English and Americans from the embassy would come with me. So that's how I got my information, and I got a totally different picture. I went to a meeting of the headquarters, and military headquarters in Saigon. Before I went to Saigon, I was stopped off in Honolulu with the top commander for all forces of the Pacific, called SIGPAC. And I was stopped off there and be briefed. And what I heard was the same old stuff, you know, more bombs, etc., more troops, etc. And that's the same thing that I got when I got to Saigon and listened to these generals being briefed. It was like another world, like they were fighting a war in another place in a different way. It was amazing. It was shocking. And it only confirmed me, and even strongly, that this was the wrong war at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. It was an unnecessary war, and I say this in my book. So these people were a great help. I talked to the lieutenants. I would talk to nobody above a captain. I refused to talk to anybody above a captain, because these are the people that are in the field. No colonels, no lieutenant colonels. On one occasion, I talked to a major general in 1967. That was another trip. He was a great guy. He was fighting in Burma, but he was an intelligence officer in Burma during World War II. And here he was, the head of a section of Vietnam, Corps 2 it is called, Corps 2, which includes Saigon, the Cambodian border, on down to the Channel. And I got an appointment with him, because Roger knew him. This is after Roger is dead. Roger knew him. So he was very happy to speak with me. Now, General Westmoreland, who was in charge of U.S. forces, was back in Washington urging for more troops and more money, and saying that how we were winning the war and the communists had been backed up to the borders. And I talked to this general. He said to me, "I don't know what in the hell," he said, "what in the hell Westy's talking about? I could be hit at any time by the Viet Cong and I would not know it was coming or where it was coming from." I had lunch with this man for 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours with him. What an individual he was. And he gave me a totally different outlook that I was getting from many of the general officers. Now this man finally, he was the last, after the war was over, after we had lost the war and did the evacuation, he was sent back to be head of what was left. And then from that, he went back to, he retired, went to Honolulu. And I talked to him 3 times after he retired. And the last time, I called. I found out from his aide that he had just passed away. Wonderful man. I've never forgotten him. He should have been the man in charge from the very beginning, not Westmoreland. We would have had a different kind of results. So that's how I found out what was going on. And I got to the point that when the Nixon administration came in, along with Kissinger, they did not agree with my claims and my assessments. I had been decorated so many times prior to this, they couldn't fire me. All they could do was kick me out, put me in another job. So they sent me up to the 8th floor. There's nobody there, except equipment and stuff. And I had a little room, no number on it, no window, just a telephone. I was there for almost 2 years until Carter came in. That's what happened to me. I was thrown out. That was the beginning of the end, I thought. I spent all these years, and here I was nothing. Nobody would talk with me or anything, except Dan Ellsberg. Dan Ellsberg found out about me. He was working at the Pentagon then, writing the Pentagon papers. And he would come over and sought me out. And I had to be very careful. But we did meet several times. And I enjoyed it very much. And one day he said to me, "Lou, I want you to come have breakfast right away." It was on a Friday. I said, "Well, I got to go to work." "No, it's important. You got to come." So I went. I met him at DuPont Circle at the restaurant. I had just a bite to eat before I left. We were living across the street there in the bigger house. And he said to me, "Have breakfast." I said, "Well, I had breakfast all right, Dan." "Well, you know, I'm worried, Lou. I think Nixon's going to put U.S. troops into North Vietnam." "Oh, come on," I said. "Given all the opposition to the Vietnam War, which was rampant in this country, how could he possibly do that?" "Well, I think it's either that or bombing North Vietnam directly." I said, "Well, Dan, I think that'd be the wrong thing to do. I mean, gee whiz, we're in trouble now with other countries over what we're doing in Vietnam." "I know, but this man he's rampant." Well, a few days later, I heard about what Dan did. Pentagon Papers, he released him. I was surprised. It wasn't long before that, very shortly, maybe a couple of days, 2 FBI people came to my office, sought me out. And they said, "You know Dan Ellsberg?" I said, "Yeah." "Well, what do you think about what he did?" I said, "Look, Dan Ellsberg has been my friend for several years now. I could not do what he did because I have a big family to support. I just couldn't do that." "Well, is he still your friend?" "Well, as far as I know, I hope we're still friends." Those 2 guys walked out of the office and slammed the door in my face. And then one day when I came home, Lula said, "You know, I think I hear noise on our phone. When I pick up the phone, it doesn't sound right." I said, "Well, I don't know. Maybe something's going." "Well, don't you think maybe somebody's tapping in?" "I don't know." Then I heard later that Kissinger had tapped into friends of mine that were working for him in the White House. And one of those guys had worked for me before he went to Saigon, that he had tapped their phones. So then I began to think, well, maybe Lula was right. Maybe our phone was being tapped. And then one day, I got a phone call from a senator's office, saying, a senator from Alaska. And the aide said, "The senator would like to come and see you." I said, "Well, why?" "He wants to talk about Vietnam." I said, "Well, that's all right. But, you know, he can't come during the day. He'll have to come in the evening. Say around 9 o'clock. It was odd. So, at 9:15 or so, There's a knock on the door, and there's the senator from Alaska. He's got his hand in a sling. Says, I got tennis elbow. That's why I'm late. So I asked, I said, well, can my wife sit in on this conversation? Oh, yes, because she's a witness to this now. So he proceeded to tell me, you know, we got to keep the ball rolling. You know what Dan did. We got to keep the ball rolling now. Do you have any classified information you could pass on to me? I could use that to keep the ball rolling on Vietnam. I said, sir, I couldn't do that. That's classified information. If I were to do it, I would go to jail because I've sworn not to do it. And he said, well, that's okay. And I'd lose my job. And I have a family to support. And he said, well, you know, you could come and work on the Hill for us then. I said, I've worked on the Hill, and I prefer what I'm doing here at the State Department. So he got up to leave. Then he turned around and said, well, if you change your mind, let me know. And Lula saw this whole thing now. She was there. He left. I never saw him again, never heard from him. Well, the Nixon administration is out now. They have had Watergate, etc., etc. And I've written about Nixon's involvement in Vietnam and the things that he did, and the accelerated bombing and so forth and so on. It was hitting dikes and villages, etc. And that's what Kissinger and Nixon wanted to do. So I was put up in this place in exile. And one day, I came out of my office. I would come home around noontime. Wasn't anything for me to do. I'd take the kids over to Kenwood Country Club and play golf or go fishing somewhere. I enjoyed it. But I felt sorry for them because I had two sons who were interning in the State Department during this period, George and Jonathan. One was in my bureau, and George was in the Policy Bureau that Dick Holbrook ran. That was a real incompetent guy. Boy, oh boy, Dick Holbrook. And so I would come home early. And one day, I meet a guy who worked at CIA. I know him quite well, Bill Highland. And he said to me, what are you doing now, Lou? You didn't attend the division meeting. I said, what division meeting? He was head of my bureau now. Well, I'm no longer in the bureau. I'm doing that. He said, well, I'd like for you to come and let's have lunch today and talk someday. Okay, Bill. Very nice guy. He liked to play the banjo and song. He was a good man. Worked at CIA, very important job at CIA. So there was an occasion when I came out of this place of darkness that I was, that's what I call the place of darkness that I was in. And I see this little lady, thin lady, bending down, picking up her papers. So I went over and I helped her. And then she said to me after I gave her all, she says, well, that's very nice of you. Who are you? I said, well, I'm Lou Sarris. Sarris? What kind of name is that? So I'm Greek born. And she says, oh my goodness, do you know Edith Hamilton? She says, I went to Bryn Mawr with her. I said, yes, I know all the things that she wrote about ancient Greece. And she hugged me. And I wondered, who is this lady? And then she told me her name. She says, well, I'm Margaret Dulles. Alan Foster and John Foster, Dulles' sister. I said, I'm doing a special project here at the State Department. And I don't want to be downstairs. I want to be up here by myself. I'm quiet. And she was so gracious to me and so nice. Totally unlike her brothers. Different personality, whatever. Whether it's John Foster or Alan Dulles. And later people would say to me when I told them this story, you know, Lou, perhaps she's the only person that ever liked her in the State Department. And I'm very proud of that. So that's how I met her. But shortly after this, I was Nixon administration had gone, had left, thank goodness, Kissinger included. I had personal relations with Kissinger, which ran foul. The man had lied and done all kinds of things. And he personally lied to me. And so when they left and Carter came in, another Jewish friend of mine from the Pentagon, who's now was president of later current foreign relations in New York, the Council of Foreign Relations. Name doesn't come. Very good man. He came and became Assistant Secretary of State for Military Political Affairs. I was still nowhere. And he got in touch with my boss and he says, I read a paper that Lou wrote, and so I was still being paid, you see, but I had no position. I'd like for him to come and work for me on political military affairs. He said, sure. So he called me down, and I went to work for him. He was so impressed with me because he had heard of me from Dan Ellsberg. He had heard about me because he was Dan's boss. And he took my report, had it declassified. It was circulating all over town. I got an invitation as a result of that to go to the Council of Foreign Relations in New York and make a presentation. And that was published in a book. That was the first published book that I was involved in. Oh, I wrote this article against McNamara in 1995, but I mean, this is something else. And so I was very proud of that. And on the plane back, I met Joe Kraft. I knew Joe Kraft. He's a good friend of mine. You know who he was, a journalist. Joe Kraft, journalist. And he said to me, I heard about this, Lou. That's great. Well, I said, I got a job again. But I wasn't back in the Bureau. But then that's when I met Bill Hyland. And he brought me back to the Bureau, gave me back my old job, but promoted me to Deputy Director for East Asia and all the Pacific. And I got a medal for it that's hanging up in that room back there. It's not amongst my medals there. And I was, in effect, my assessments and my personal integrity were restored because I was right all along and they were wrong. Yeah, I consider myself a very fortunate man, at the age of 91 particularly. We've been married for 69 years to a beautiful woman that I never expected to find. A talented actress, a talented singer, a demeanor that was kind and sweet and not very loquacious. And it was falling in love at first sight, I can truthfully say. And she has been the inspiration for me throughout my entire life. And she's been I think there's a phrase, the wind below my wings, in everything that I did. And she made many sacrifices for me. My wife's name is Lulu. There aren't many people that I know who are Lulus, but she is the Lulu of Lulus. And she lived in my hometown, and I never knew her until I went to a party once. And there I met this beautiful lady, and it was automatic, it was immediate. So she's been what I've always wanted and thought I'd never find. And we were very happy together, lovingly, uncommitted, totally committed. Has helped me all along the way, both in the households that we've had, but as importantly in my long professional career. She's done so much for me. and that she sacrificed her many talents that she had. She never again pursued them, gave them up, just to raise our 5 children: George, Jeffrey, Timothy, Jonathan, and Alicia. The only one that's here, living here now, is Jeffrey. But they all come at different times, so we see them all. And we're very close. And they're all professional people, singers, PhDs, home builders, CFOs, that's the kind of, and nurse anesthetists. Those are the kind of people they are. And we're so proud of them. They've never caused us any difficulty whatever. And when I hear of things going on in this world, we're so fortunate that our children are what they are today. But Lulu is the heart of the whole thing. George, I would say, I think of him as a bright, intellectual, willing to do anything for anybody. But then I can say the same thing for Jeffrey, who's a very giving person, but also our son Timothy, who has a certain naivety about him, which looks at people and will do anything for them, and frequently does. And he's our lyric baritone, who now lives in Italy. With Jonathan, a true historian. He's head of the history department at North Carolina Wesleyan. He's been published. He knows all about the Civil War, and he's been invited to go in many parts of the country and give lectures on the subject, including England. And then there's Alicia, who's the baby of the family. And she, I must say, she had a tough road to hoe. 4 brothers. But then one day I saw her outside playing football with her brothers, and she was able to throw the football, what do you call it, a spin, a beautiful pass. I was amazed. And Alicia went to several schools and finally found the one that she liked. She graduated magna cum laude, no summa cum laude, from Maryland University, and then went in nursing, and then went to Kent State University with her husband when they went to Cleveland to live. He is a doctor, and she got her master's degree, and then went on again and became from a nurse to a nurse practitioner. She is now a nurse anesthetist. And George is cum laude graduate, and Jonathan was magna cum laude graduate. Tim was graduated with distinction and got his master's training at a very honorable, very private, and very excellent school of music, where he sang and learned to sing. So we're so proud of all of our children. There's nothing about them that I find, to object with. I'm so proud of them. And much of that goes to what their mother did for them. Well, Lulu was really the instrument of stability for the family at this point. I have been removed from my position, living on the 8th floor in a dark place. It was very hard on me. And then I had 2 sons who were interning in the State Department at the time, George and Jonathan. One was interning in the Policy Bureau, Far East Policy Bureau, George. Jonathan was interning in my bureau. I had nothing to do with them getting the job. They qualified, and so it really felt very bad at that particular time. But Lulu was constantly, I came home very sad in the times. I would come home early because there was nothing for me to do, and she would always smile and give me a hug, and she'd always make me feel like I was doing the right thing by standing for my views. She always said that, on my views on Vietnam and the war that became an Indochina war. You got to remember, the Vietnam War was just not on Vietnam. It started that way, but it was made into a second Indochina war because then we got involved in Laos and Cambodia. That was an awful period. So it was that kept me going, because I was very depressed during this time. And I looked forward to just coming home and going with the kids over at Kenwood Country Club and playing golf or going fishing all the way to a town close to Baltimore, Maryland, which is the hometown of a famous movie actor. I forget his name right now. And George caught his first bass fish in that little pond. And Jonathan caught about 18 little fish at a pond in outside of north of Rockville. So I did that so often just to keep my energy up and my confidence in myself. But ultimately, it was Lula who really managed that, keep that sense of stability within the family and confidence in that I was doing the right thing. Sometimes I doubted myself. I felt that, what am I doing here? I'm only with a small group of people in the department who are fighting the war, against the war, and fighting the Pentagon and the military establishment in Saigon. Just a handful of us. And there were times when I felt, there's no point in my doing this. It isn't worth it. Can I have that much to do? Can I provide that much support? But it was because of Lula and the kids, and also I had two principals, both assistant secretaries of state. One of them just passed away about 2 months ago, Roger Hilsman. And he gave me all the confidence that I needed. And he gave me carte blanche to write what I wanted to write and write it as I saw the situation. And those two factors really kept me going. Yeah, I retired in 1987. I stayed on for 2 years as a consultant. I didn't go in every day. And I became an adjunct professor at Maryland University and at Montgomery College. And then I gave lectures at various government institutions, the American Defense College University, and at GW and at Georgetown I gave a lecture. And then I lectured in Baltimore, and I went all the way down to Georgia and to North Carolina, and I gave lectures there, all on American foreign policy. And of course the question always was Vietnam. And at the University of Virginia, I was asked to come and lecture at the university. I didn't seek it out. The famous Miller Center of UVA, the head of the director of that Miller Center, asked me to come down, and they'd read my article on McNamara, in which I took him apart completely in 1995. He lied so much, and I called him a liar. And they saw this, and they asked me to come down there and give a lecture. So I enjoyed that. it was one of the happiest periods of my post-professional life, being with these young people. It really invigorated me, and it made me feel as if that's what I always wanted to do anyway, to be a teacher in some college. I didn't come here to get into government. I came to get my doctorate degree and teaching, as Senator Matthew Neely said to me when I left him. He says, "Now, Lou, I want you someday to come back and teach at some West Virginia university." He was a West Virginian. So I really felt like this was a new period in my life. After that, of course, I had heart attacks, and I gave that up, and then I began writing. But I enjoyed the teaching very much. So I like to travel. I did a lot of traveling for the department. I went around the world twice. But the travel with my family, frequently to Florida, and the various locations nearby, but also to New York. But I think the most unusual trip was just Lula and I when we took a long trip to Europe. Well, there were two trips before that, I might add. Toward the end of my career, I was doing a lot of NATO work, and I'd go to the NATO meetings and represent the department. So on both occasions, on two of the three occasions, I took Lula with me, and she met for the first time this Dutch family that virtually adopted me during the war. And we became very good friends, and she knows all the kids and so forth. And that was a wonderful trip, Brussels, Paris, London. And then we took a non-professional trip. I wanted to go back to Greece. That was in 1997. She and I went alone. And it just brought me back to another dimension of my life that it became almost mythological. It was gone, and it was all revived when I went to Greece with Lulu. We did Athens, of course. We went to even Constantinople, or Istanbul as they call it then. Istanbul is taken from the Greek, which means Istin Poli, to the city. So when Ataturk came over, the great Ataturk, reformist, sorry he's not around anymore, it was called Istanbul. And we went there, we went to the famous museum, and took the trip through the Straits of the Dardanelles with a boat, went up into the Black Sea area, and we went to the famous Cathedral of St. Sophia, which has become a mosque now, but they don't celebrate it as a mosque. They still have the original Byzantine paintings all over the walls and the sides and the ceiling. That was a beautiful sight. And then we went to Athens, to spend Athens. And from there we also took a boat trip up into the Aegean Sea and around, went up north to the Aegean Sea and saw all those, from the shore we saw those monasteries that the Greek Orthodox Christians had built. And I saw one that had a connection to receive videos. There was a video which outside you could see it, and I laughed at it. Here the monks had a video that they could see movies and whatever they wanted to see. Then we went down to the southern Greece, where I stood in one particular place, one beautiful city, looking out to the sea, and I quoted a passage from Lord Byron, that he had written. Byron was the great Phil Helene. He was a major cause for the British getting involved in the Greek war against the Ottoman Turks. So I quoted something from him, from the a poem from the Prisoner of Shiloh, in which the prisoner says, "My hair is white, nor grew it white in a single year. My head is bowed, nor did it become bowed from something or other." I quoted, I knew it then, I quoted. I felt I had to do that for Byron. So that was a wonderful trip back. Of course, we had people taking care of the children. A lot of them were grown up, of course. They didn't need us anymore. But that was the most unusual trip. But New York was a wonderful trip, and going to Florida so often with the children. Those were very enjoyable trips. Well, we have 7 grandchildren. One of them is only 11 years old, and he's already a poet. He'd been published by the one newspaper in North Carolina. And I'm just amazed at those children. Of course, one of them is a freshman this year, the only gal that we have. They're all boys except one who's a girl. Zoe is her name, and she's at the University of Virginia Commonwealth University, and she is studying, she's a freshman, is studying movie making. And I expect someday I'll be watching a movie and I'll see her name either in the cast or in the supporting people who do all the work. So we're happy about all of our grandchildren. We're also very proud of what our son Timothy is doing. He's been singing all his life. He has sung all over the world. Japan, Uruguay, Venezuela, Canada. He's traveled the United States twice with the San Francisco Opera. He sang at the Met. He decided to leave and go to Italy. And that's where he's living now and singing there. Singing all over Italy, sang in Budapest. And we're so happy that he still has that great voice, the lyric baritone, and he gets that from his mother. His mother was a mezzo or a contralto, in between there somewhere. And I think he gets his voice from her. But then she gets her voice from her mother, who we believe, her mother, is related to a Romanian princess, Princess Ileana, who later came to the United States after World War II and became a nun. And her name is Mother Alexandra. She's written a book about angels. And this is my next project. After I finish my memoirs, or my odyssey, call it what you will, I'm going to do the genealogy of Lulu's. Because I've done the genealogy of my mother, and I think that deserves to be done. It allegedly goes back to Queen Victoria because of what her grandfather did, who married this woman who was related. I want to speak about my grandchildren now. Our son George, the eldest, has three children. Louis the second, Bradley, and Zoe. She's the only girl that he has. And she's in the University of Commonwealth in Virginia. She's a freshman and studying the field of movie making. Then Jonathan has 2 boys, Robert Ellis and Theodore. And Robert is a poet already. He's only about 11 years old, and he's a poet. He's been published. Theodore has a way of making up phrases that are so relevant to a discussion. He's very creative in that respect. Then Timothy does not have any children. Jeffrey doesn't have any children either. Alicia has 2 girls, Sarah and Ava. Sarah is a born actress, what have you, and filmmaking. She wants to get into filmmaking also. Ava, the number 2, is very vivacious and just a delightful person, and always laughing, you know, cutting up and so forth. And she wrote something about me and put it in the computer, and I have it still. I was her hero. And she said he came from Greece, the whole thing, you know. So those are the only grandchildren we have. There's 7 grandchildren. I'm sorry that neither Jeffrey nor Timothy have any, but that's their way of life. Thank you. I would like to make one final comment, and that is, what advice would I give to my children and my grandchildren? My views are to always be truthful. Always think about other people and what you can do for them. Because that is the tradition, not only of the Jewish people, who have that tradition deeply embedded in them, to do something, leave something behind that is worthwhile. That is what I like to see them do. Leave something behind that is worthwhile. And you do that by doing things for other people and maintaining your own sense of objectivity and relying on truthfulness to be your motivating factor in your life. That is my advice for them.